Yeah.
Bring us in
Well,
here.
I have a little intro I thought was good, so I'm still gonna say it.
Do it, do it.
So this film is really weird, and although parts of it, as I said, were interesting, genuinely scary, and overall fun, much of the plot and some of the acting were just missing entirely from it.
Yeah, very true.
The act also, just as a general thing, I can't deal with people when they're acting and it's bad. Like when I
Mhm.
feel there's disingenuousness, I feel so physically uncomfortable that like I want to leave. And there's like times where that's fun in movies and times where it's
Mhm.
like, I really just hate this. And this is
Yeah.
one of those, I really just hate this because like their relationship just wasn't believable. So much of their conversations were like really awkward and uncomfortable. And you could
Mhm.
tell like as actors, they were uncomfortable underwater.
Mhm.
Um, or like maybe they were really just divers and they needed divers and they weren't actually actors, so they were learning how to act while underwater. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the story was. All I know is that I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah.
And the closer we got to the end of the film, the more I just totally lost interest in like what was happening because I didn't understand what was happening. And it wasn't in like a fun way, like the books we read, where
Mhm.
it was like cool that we didn't know because like questions are fun because then you get answers eventually. Maybe
Yeah.
I didn't want to know the answers were because they were dumb.
Yeah.
And it probably didn't help that the plot was like super predictable in that I called the big reveal within like the first one fourth of the movie.
Mhm.
I saw a
Mhm.
picture underwater and I was like, Pierre sent them there because the house eats them and he's their family.
Mhm.
Like I said that to myself and I think I texted it to you and I was like, well, I was right and that's stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I will say is the film was very well done visually and it was very satisfying visually to watch. And I think if I went into it with a different headspace, with different expectations, I may have enjoyed it a bit more. I recognize my own like bias in that. And overall, with this watch, I was expecting more emotionally and mentally. And in that area, it was lacking significantly for me. And I also recognize that like there's a cultural difference between the perspective of this French film and my very American experience, always like educating myself on these horrific things. That I was like, I don't know, I just like expected to learn something, I guess. I don't know.
Mhm.
And it didn't. It was just a fun underwater haunted house film, and that's fine. But as I said, as Gabe's mentioned, and I'm going to talk about, it's like, I don't know, I had a hard time enjoying it because I was like, I just expected it to like be talking about something or like educating me on something. And as like an American where there's actual towns that have been intentionally buried underwater, like I just expected more. I don't know. And
Mhm.
it's not their place to tell that story because they told the story that was their story, and that's fine. But yeah, I guess I just was expecting to like learn something because as ghouls in general, we just approach movies all the time with the mentality that horror is always saying something. And it just made me hard. It made it hard for me to actually enjoy the film because I kept waiting for it to tell me something and then it never did.
Mhm.
But all that's to say that the film is fine. It just wasn't for me. And if it was for you, awesome. I really hope you
Yeah.
enjoyed it because it was fun. I imagine it would be fun if I went into it with a different time. But I also want to say I didn't want like a trauma movie either. I just wanted
Mhm.
something to like make me think or feel anything afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, but I did do some research on like, well, why are they writing about underwater house? What's happening in France that would motivate underwater house time? If that's a thing, I just was trying to connect dots. I was trying to like make it
Mhm.
say something to
Give
me.
them some credit, yeah.
Yeah. So I wrote a list of possible reasons why they focused on flooding in underwater houses in this film. So specifically, in France, there seems to be some reasonable anxiety around the sinking or flooding of cities because of the threat of climate change and the fact that France has a decent amount of coastal towns
Mhm.
that result in like rising water levels from climate change, both in like oceanside as well as lakeside. Um, I will say they seem to be less at risk than some of the northern countries, but it does seem a fair amount of their coastal cities will see damage and significant flooding as water levels continue to rise. I actually found a like cool list, but also like an article that talked about this, and they said Climate Central's warming choices map shows several districts of Bordeaux falling under sea levels in temperature as they increase from 3C above pre-industrial levels in the very long term. The Palace de Quinconce, for example, will be almost largely submerged. Further south, Anglais would also be partially submerged, with the Cavaliers Beach falling underwater. The Côte d'Azur would also be hard hit, with the city's airport shown surprisingly as partially submerged in the long term future, even at 1°C, which I don't know what that means.
Celsius,
Maybe Celsius,
maybe?
and almost entirely covered at 2°C. It could just be like the
Like
labeling
a
for the,
sea levels?
yeah, sea levels. Other popular towns and city in the areas, such as Cannes and Antibes, uh, and the Principality of Monaco, will also be impacted by these rising sea levels. In the north, virtually all of Calais and Dunkirk will fall under the sea, even with temperatures increasing by just 1.5, I think it is Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. As this map, which I've linked, shows, the time frame for when these dramatic changes could take place remains vague, with Climate Central saying that the diverse research indicates that these sea levels could be realized between 200 and 2,000 years from now. But either way, it's like our kids will experience that. um, and then Benjamin Strauss, president and CEO of Climate Central, has recently co authored a paper titled Unprecedented Threats to the Cities from Multi-Century Sea Level Rise. And that goes into like more detail about it. But essentially, there have also just been a lot of like history of flooding in France, which is not something that I knew, as well as recently that that's taken place. Specifically, the River Seine and Paris has a history of flooding, as well as the other rivers in France, because of either rainfall or um, just like the way the cities are built, it seems like they're prone to flooding, which could be why the topic of flooding in a house being taken by water may have seemed like an interesting plot point. Um, as a more random fun fact, I also read something of a source that may or may not have been accurate based on the fact that it was from a random WordPress site. But essentially, that there were filmmakers in the 1960s that were making a mermaid movie. They built a miniature underwater city for a film they were making that still exists today. And the WordPress site says if you look from the port of Gulf Juan towards Ile Sainte Marguerite, you'll see a small striped lighthouse, La Pierre Formigny, midway in the bay. 30 meters underwater near this lighthouse lie the remains of a 1,000 M2 French town, complete with ramparts, church, hotel, hairdressers, town square, and amphitheater, but they're like little mini ones. Like they're it's like a cute set that they made under there.
Yeah.
It's not a real city.
Yeah.
So like those are all super fun. And maybe that's what they were poking fun at. Or maybe they just thought it was like a cool idea. Which it was. It was. It was cool.
Mhm.
Underwater time. Love it. But as we said, sunken towns is like a really real thing in America. In fact, there are like hundreds of them. Maybe more. I don't know. That was a lot. I knew I was going to find a lot, but like the volume with which I found sunken towns was like, ugh,
Yeah.
sadness. Reasonably. So I'm going to talk about that. And if you don't want to hear about that because it's really stressful and you don't wish to be stressed right now or traumatized, it's totally fine.
Mhm.
Click away, go to the end. I'm sure we'll be talking about something else by the end of this. We'll have a
Mhm.
cute little outro and it'll be great. But essentially, the first time I heard about this was from the viral video by Amber Ruffin, which she's had a few on the Amber Ruffin show.
I
She's a
love
comedian.
her.
Yeah, she's great.
Amazing.
Where they start to discuss like black towns that were destroyed to make way for lakes and parks. And like I had I knew about the Central Park situation. I forget Seneca Village was
Mhm.
it? Yeah, I knew about that one, but I did not know about the lakes thing or like the reservoirs, dams, other things that they had done to like hundreds of towns across America. But apparently, there are unfortunately many towns in America that were vacated in quotes because they were forcefully relocated
Mhm.
or just straight up like drowned, demolished and flooded to make way for dams, reservoir, and lakes. The list that I am about to talk about doesn't even include the communities that were forced to relocate for other non water based infrastructure
Yeah.
projects. And that list, I'm sure, is even longer. I say many, like literally in all caps, because the amount of locations I found in my search was way more than I could even kind of cover in 30 minutes or less. So I'm going to touch on some and then list other locations. So, like, if you're interested, and want to know more, you can go look into it more
Mhm.
yourself. And as I was talking to Gabe before this, because I was like, "This is not enough time to cover all of these things." She was like, "We could cover it again
Yeah,
later. You know, we could talk
absolutely.
about sunken towns again later, and maybe we will. We likely will, because we're gonna be going on forever. So we're gonna eventually need to talk about more things, and likely one of those things will be this in more detail." But it seems that there are a lot of locations that this happened to, and that these forced relocations happen largely, although not exclusively, in the West and predominantly impact BIPOC communities. There were some articles I found that discussed the sunken towns in a way that was kind of uncomfortable too, in that they mention who is impacted, but discuss it in a way that does not in any way give enough respect, in my opinion, to the devastation that was attached to those forced
Mhm.
relocations, using words like
Mhm.
development and progress and other gross words that America uses often to euphemize or euphemism away
Yeah.
hate crimes. They're like, "It was for a reason, though," and it's like, "No, it
Yeah.
wasn't, though." Like, it was for white
It was
people,
just
and to say
'cause.
that, like, yeah, you just wanted to hurt through racism millions of people, and you did that. Great job, guy. But the one article that I found that had a lot of like very specific information was one of those. But I will say, like, the way that they talk about it is just very much like just in a
Mhm.
documentation kind of way. Like they're just telling you it
Yeah.
happened is a record. They do not give any opinion or
Mm.
critique in any way. And
Hmm.
it was just like, okay. But it's from the Center of Land Use Interpretations newsletter, The Lay of the Land, spring 2005. So there could even be more in there. I just specifically found 2005's version, and it's titled Immersed Remains Towns Submerged in America. And they go into kind of detail about a few of these that were specifically relocated and flooded for dams and reservoirs. So Elbow Woods, North Dakota, Kennett, California, Enfield, Massachusetts, Neversink, New
Ironic.
York, which is just like ironic. Butler, Tennessee, St. Thomas, Nevada. Each of these towns represents a different element of America's development, in quotes. Yet they all share the same fate. They and hundreds of other communities like them were vacated, demolished, and flooded to make way for dams and reservoirs. Their remnants persist, preserved underwater, and sometimes emerge as reminders of what was not
Mm.
allowed to be. So, Elbow Woods, North Dakota, was a flooded plain. It was one of several Native American towns along the Missouri River, which were predominantly or permanently flooded following the completion of the Garrison Dam in North Dakota in 1953. Um, Essentially, it seems like they set it up as if that wasn't going to
Mhm.
happen, but that the third largest reservoir in the country flooded a quarter of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, forcing the relocation of 325 families, nearly 80% of the population of the reservation at the time. Many moved to newly established community in Newtown, where now 1,500 members of the three affiliated tribes live next to apparently a casino. But that was a lot of people that were forcefully relocated for a dam, a garrison dam, and were flooded. So, Kennett, California, is apparently an old mining town. There's a faded relic in Boomtown south of the time. It was flooded by Lake Shasta in 1944, but it was still home to 100 plus people, basically people who had traveled during the gold rush and other areas of California. And it was flooded essentially in 1944. It doesn't necessarily say that that was intentional, but it says that it was entirely flooded, and the town now rests below 400 feet of water, along with many region smelters, paint factories, and mines, as well surrounded by
Hmm.
despoiled soils. Um, Neversink, New York. They say it's Gotham's thirsty reach. I don't really know what that means, but I thought it was an interesting little qualifier. Um, Neversink, whose name is said to be derived of the word Nawasink, meaning continuously
Mm.
flowing in the native language of that area. And it was larger of two communities that were removed from the reservoir site in 1942. So essentially, 340 people were evicted from the valley, and 6,149 acres were condemned. Some buildings were relocated to nearby towns, though most were bulldozed and burned in a final
Yikes.
harvest. Trees were removed, cellars were filled in, privies disinfected, and even barnyard manure was said to have been dug up to be relocated and to maintain New York City's reputation for having the finest quality drinking water possible. The Neversink Reservoir began to flood the land on June 4th, 1953, and took 2 years to fill. Also, New York's water is polio right now, so I don't know if
Well, this was
it's liking.
1942,
Uh,
so
Yeah. But yeah, the next one is Enfield, Massachusetts. As I said, they're not all in the West or the South. Apparently, the scenic New England village were essentially demolished, deforested by over 1,000 woodpeckers, immigrant workers from Boston who at times ran amok in quotes in the doomed landscape. As I said, this
yeah.
is like written like in a way that totally does not give cadence to how um devastating this was, and that they were living in vacated houses along the main streets, burning churches without authorization. So I don't really know, but essentially there was a town there. The valley was on fire apparently for many months, where 2,500 people were relocated. 7,000 bodies from local cemeteries were returned onto higher ground, and then they were flooded essentially in 1946. I think it was a dam that was built. Yeah, the Valley of the Damned is what they named it. So a dam was built for one purpose only, to serve as drinking waters for the needs of Boston, 60 miles away. Still called the largest single-purpose reservoir in the nation, is the city's primary
Wow.
water source. So, as I said, they buried an entire stretch of land for Boston. In Butler, Tennessee, Butler was was the largest single community and the only incorporated town. Was removed by the Tennessee Valley Authority throughout the entire massive Depression era public works project to modernize and electrify rural parts of the seven southeastern United States. Butler was the commercial center for the Watauga Valley in eastern Tennessee, and the only real town in the region with a population of around 600 people. It was a typical southern town with two barbershops, two beauty parlors, markets, Bluebird Cafe, hardware store, drugstore, a few service stations, hotels, churches, etc. Um, they were all located in the forested hills of Appalachia. And essentially, in 1948, when the floodgates were closed, the Watauga Dam and Reservoir began flooding 458 square miles along the Watauga River. 735 families had been displaced. Around 175 buildings, including shops, barns, churches, homes, were moved to higher ground to a new town in the site of New Butler. Most buildings were demolished on site and 1,200 bodies removed from grave sites. Some families opted to leave the graves of their ancestors undisturbed, so they are still there
Hmm.
underneath. And when Old Butler was exposed in 1983, drawdown conducted to the service of the dam, they found a lot of stuff underneath of
That
there.
was preserved?
Essentially, yeah, there was a shoe store, a jailhouse, other foundational pieces, and etc., long dead but preserved by the muddy water. Not the last on my
Mm.
list, unfortunately. St. Thomas, Nevada, like most of the early settlements in the desert Southwest, St. Thomas was established in an area of available water. In this case, apparently, it's 50 miles northeast of where Las Vegas is now. This town started as a Mormon outpost in 1865 and was later part of a chain of agricultural communities in the valley following the Muddy River, including Moapa, Longdale, Overton, that were
I
otherwise
did not
surrounded
know
by
Mormons
desert.
went that far
Uh,
back. I didn't know that. Well,
yeah, apparently they did. Yeah. A railroad spur survey in the valley of the US 91 and the main highway to Los Angeles before Interstate 15 went through town, making stops for motorists. So essentially, there were ways to get to this. But in 1938, Lake Mead crept northward, filling in and behind the Buller Dam, St. Thomas located at the lower elevation at the southern end of the valley, and that was flooded. So at that moment, due to regional drought conditions, portions of 40 buildings are visible in the exposed remains of St. Thomas, including the old school, an ice cream parlor, and other foundational pieces where former President Herbert Hoover apparently stayed in a hotel
Mm.
that was buried under the water. Um, and the Boulder Dam, which flooded the town, was later renamed in his
Hmm.
honor, which is
Yeah.
interesting. There are a lot of other instances of drowned towns, specifically in
Mhm.
Alabama, in Georgia, like the one that Gabe mentioned
Linear.
earlier. That one's like super sad because Lanier. One is named after a Confederate soldier, so like not
Mhm.
even kind of subtle. Um, and, like, people
Yeah.
drown there all the time because there's stuff underneath of there, like, they have to cut the
Yeah.
trees to hide it, to, like, protect the population from knowing the awful things that happen there, I
Well, it's like
guess.
how the girl got
But
snagged
yeah, like
on, like, just debris in the movie. It's just like that's how easy it is. Like
yeah.
you're just swimming and you get caught.
Yeah, because there's, like, whole trees under there,
Like
an
houses and
entire town,
mhm.
just houses, everything under there, and people, like, go swimming there, they bring boats there, and, like,
Mhm.
die because there's all this stuff under there that people can get swept into or caught on otherwise. Um, and that was like the example of like essentially there was this whole town there and a predominantly black town that was like self-sufficient and running, and essentially there was the case of a girl who got beat up and they were like, obviously we're going to blame the town with the
Mhm.
black people in it, so they blamed 2 teenagers that
Yeah.
likely had nothing to do with it, and then burned, attacked, exploited, otherwise the town until people left, and I guess if people didn't
Yeah.
leave, they just drowned them. I don't really know. But essentially that one in Georgia has a really upsetting history, and a lot of people
Mhm.
just
Lake
don't know
Lanier.
about it,
Yeah.
which is awesome. Yeah, Lake Lanier. And again, I saw another article on Alabama's AL.com titled Drowned Towns: What Traces of Ghost Cities Lie Beneath Alabama's Man Made Lakes. And apparently, there are just
Mhm.
a lot of man made lakes that are just on top of cities uh, or towns specifically. Um, Logan Martin Lake was man made and is on top of a town. Um, Lake Martin, specifically, Waterloo, a tiny patch of Lauderdale County that takes up part of there's a lake under there that has a town under it. Riverton was a small Colbert County town flooded when Pickwick Dam was built on the Tennessee River. It all kind of ties back to them trying to erase BOPSC populations in really like gross and uncomfortable ways. So there's just like an
Mhm.
extremely long list, an uncomfortably long list of all these towns that exist. That is really upsetting to read about. But if you would like to read about it, I'm going to include like as many as I can find
Mhm.
in my blog. Um, and if you want to learn more about it, I kind of just said some of them as a jumping off point for you too, and maybe we'll come back to them, as I said before, to give a more like thorough overview because that was definitely not
Mhm.
enough information for you to get like a full picture ultimately.
Yeah, and it's definitely not the only way or the first way that like or like city planning infrastructure was used as or like weaponized to
Yeah.
erase entire communities of people that they just, wanted to do away with. And like in that episode of Atlanta when, he says it was like a self-made black town too.
Yeah.
Like how often does that happen? Or entire reservations. Like those are people who've already been transplanted and put into these tiny areas are trying to make do and then they're like, "No, you got to move again."
Yeah.
And no one cares. Like
Yeah.
and the fact that there, isn't even that much written about it from that lens, like, because people
Yeah. It was
it
like
gets
very
covered
much,
up.
yeah, it was like covered up, and it was also like the language being used around it was very much just like it needed to happen though. And it was like, no, it definitely didn't. it definitely didn't. Just because it wasn't, like, being exploited by
Yeah.
white people doesn't mean it needed to happen, like, let other people exist and live and, like, have
Mhm.
life.
Or, like,
Um,
pick a different place, like,
yeah,
it didn't
there's
have to
more
be that
places.
place, I
It
bet.
didn't.
I bet
Yeah.
there's other places that it could have been. It's even, like,
Mhm.
just all the questions people have around even now, Louisiana post Katrina when they
Mhm.
flooded the dams, like, they did that. They broke those dams, not the hurricane, and so why were certain areas flooded of New Orleans that
Yeah, they were just like,
while others were
"Opportunity."
not, and it's, quite telling when you look at the demographics of those areas, and you're like, "Hmm." But it's an old trick of America to be like, "Oh, it's for improvement of
Yeah, they,
a
like,
specific type of
only
society."
yeah, and I mean, they say they stopped doing it, like, 70s on, but, like,
Mhm,
there was an instance, I don't remember the exact place, but, like, as recently as, like, 1990, I believe.
mhm.
And if Katrina was that, then as recently, I don't remember what year that happened, but that was recent.
2000 something. Yeah, and, like, instead they just call it something else, or it's
Yeah,
just a opportunity instead of strategic in that way. It's just like, well, while
yeah.
it's here.
And,
Yeah,
like,
it's all
yeah,
very
people just don't
interesting.
believe that people would do that, but they would. Like, there's a long history to represent the fact that they would, and they have, and they will continue to do so
Like,
if they're
y'all
not
learned
checked.
about Tulsa. Y'all learned about it.
Yeah,
Like, need us say more.
yeah. Like,
um,
people are 1,000,000% capable of doing such awful things and actively have.
mhm.
So, like, it's not shocking, it's just, like, upsetting.
Which, like, for all the terrible that the American Horror Stories episode, like, was, like, it was poorly acted, which is weird because Alicia Silverstone was in it, and she's usually a fine
Yeah.
actor, but the whole thing where it was, like, money was the driving force, where there was just, like, these wealthy people who were like, "We're gonna make money," and they
Well, that
didn't
sounds
care how many people
accurate.
died. I was like, "Yeah, that's totally" like,
Yeah,
again, it was, like, white on white crime, so it was, like,
yeah.
the poor folks were the ones which is, like, I can understand depending on who's behind the camera and creating this, Ryan Murphy, that you wouldn't want to put black bodies in that water and have that be a part of your narrative. Like,
Yeah.
not touching that is totally good. And again, I'm like totally fine with the fact that that's how the lake covered it, and that's like the point of view they went with, and why I
Like, so
think,
that's a story that they have the right to
yeah,
tell. They
yeah,
didn't have the right to tell the other story.
yeah, which is why like Atlanta did a great job. Even just hint like even that little
It
bit.
was just at the beginning of an episode, and the rest of the episode was even just something else I didn't know about until I watched that episode. I was like, "Oh
Yeah.
god."
So much of what that show covers is like, "Whoa,
Yeah.
no one's talking about those things." And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think, like, someone could easily learn from, like, these directors have now journeyed and learned how to create content in a horror film underwater to this degree, so someone else can run with that
Yeah.
idea and now actually, like, apply it to some real world horror things and do the things that horror can do that we appreciate.
Yeah.
But for what they did a good job at doing what they they're telling their
Yeah.
stories, which I think like this episode that we're making is similar to those ideas where it's just like I think we could cover sunken cities definitely again. There's going to be
Yeah.
content out there, and I think we would be able to expand on it more. So I see it coming back.
Yeah. I see it coming back too. And, like, yeah, that we can do, like, more information,
Hmm.
and with more time and more organization too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a spooky month. So tune in next week. We're going to be talking about haunted people. And we're haunted all month long. And the following month, we're going to be haunted in different places. We're going to be going places and doing stuff. And so we're very excited and also stressed about it, but it's happening. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know if you watched it. Check it out. Turn off your brain when you watch it.
Yeah.
And
If you just want a fun time, it's great. It's a great fun
yeah,
time.
just enjoy yourself. Um, yeah, well, don't get married.
Slate your kids,
Mhm.
or your kids will come back to see you in your sunken house, bringing you new victims for Satan, I guess.
Yeah, thank you.
Nom 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 nom.